Hello, everyone. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the Hammer Museum, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to tonight's Hammer Forum on the United States Electoral College and fair elections. The Hammer Forum is a monthly series of discussions about current social and political issues, and it's made possible with the generous support of the Rosenbloom Family Foundation. And this fall's Hammer Forums are all dedicated to topics relating to the 2024 U.S. presidential election, in collaboration with the Safeguarding Democracy Project at the UCLA Law School. I have a quick PSA for tonight, since we're 28 days from a major election. I'm not sure how many people in the audience are students, but I recently learned that college students have the lowest voter turnout in any voting bloc, just 17%. So I strongly encourage you all to register and get your friends to register, and then check your registration and recheck it before November 5th, and be sure to vote. And in fact, you can come right back here to the Hammer and vote. We are an official voting center from November 2nd to November 5th. So tonight we have an exciting discussion that will make us question the Electoral College system as we head towards the upcoming November election. Why does the United States use the Electoral College for choosing the president? What specific risks does this method for choosing electors pose for free and fair elections? We'll try to cover these tonight and several other election-related topics. But before we dive into tonight's discussion, I want to highlight a couple of upcoming programs. On October 15th, we'll have another Hammer Forum program called From November 5th to January 6th, Are We Ready for a Fair and Legitimate Election? And on Thursday, October 10th, we're screening a documentary called Farming While Black, which is part of our current exhibition called Breathe, Towards Climate and Social Justice. So if you'd like to stay updated on our upcoming programs and events at the Hammer, please sign up for our newsletter. You can do that on our website. And now I'd like to introduce our distinguished guests, Rick Hasen, Joey Fishkin, Amanda Hollis-Brusky, and Derek Muller. Joseph Fishkin is a professor of law at UCLA, where he teaches and writes about employment discrimination law, election law, constitutional law, education law, fair housing law, poverty and inequality, and distributive justice. Before joining the UCLA faculty, he taught for a decade at the University of Texas School of Law. Amanda Hollis-Brusky is a professor of politics at Pomona College with expertise on the modern Supreme Court and contemporary conservative political movements. She's the author of Ideas with Consequence, The Federalist Society and the Conservative Counter-Revolution, and Separate but Faithful, The Christian Right's Radical Struggle to Transform Law and Legal Culture. Derek Muller is a professor of law at the University of Notre Law School and is a nationally recognized scholar of election law. His research focuses on the role of states in the administration of federal elections, the constitutional contours of voting rights and election administration, the limits of judicial power in the domain of elections, and the Electoral College. Our moderator this evening is Rick Hasen. He's a professor of law and political science here at UCLA and director of the UCLA Law School's Safeguarding Democracy Project. Hasen is a nationally recognized expert in election law and campaign finance regulation and co-author of the leading case books on election law and remedies. After tonight's discussion, we'll have a chance to continue the conversation over some light refreshments out in the theater lobby. And thank you all for joining us. So please join me in welcoming Joey Fishkin, Amanda Hollis-Brusky, Derek Muller, and Rick Hasen.
Thank you and good evening, everyone. I'm Rick Hasen. I'm glad to be with all of you today to have this discussion about the Electoral College. Everybody complains about the Electoral College, but nobody does anything about it. Today, we're going to talk about why we have the Electoral College, whether we should keep the Electoral College, how we might get rid of the Electoral College, and whether having the Electoral College actually makes risks to our elections greater or lesser. So I want to start with a question just about the very basics, a little bit of the history, a little bit of the background, and I'm going to start by turning to Derek and ask you, Derek, why does the United States use the Electoral College for choosing the president, and do the reasons that the founders looked to when they created the Electoral College, do they still resonate today? And if not, are there other reasons that might justify keeping the Electoral College? And I'm sure that the other panelists may have things to say about that question as well. We can go through kind of my first initial set of questions, then have a more of a general discussion about all of these issues. Derek.
Great. I'll try to keep the answer under 3 hours if I can. So right at the founding, we didn't have a president. We had all these colonies doing their own thing. And when they unite, as under the Articles of Confederation, there's still no president. And under the constitutional system, there's a lot of fighting about Congress, what it should look like, a Senate, a House. And they're trying to figure out what this executive should look like and how to choose this executive, this single executive who can veto legislation, who can receive ambassadors. There's some discussion about maybe we should have a popular election for president. And as that discussion sort of goes forward, there's a lot of opposition, a very broad opposition in the Constitutional Convention. There's opposition from people who think that the people can't necessarily be trusted to know who the best candidate is. And especially if we're thinking about an election that stretches from New Hampshire to Georgia, it could be hard to figure out who that person would be. There's opposition from the slave states. The slaveholding states recognized that a lot of their political power was under things like the 3/5 clause or equal apportionment in the Senate. And so they opposed sort of the notion that you would have a popular election. And there were small states, places like Delaware and New Hampshire, that were worried their political power would be devalued because they had brokered other ways of getting representation in the House and the Senate that would be more advantageous to them. So there's a lot of opposition to just the popular election. So instead, there was a thought maybe Congress could do this. Congress could choose the president. But there was a concern that it would be too closely attached to Congress if we want an executive separate from the legislature. So the thought came very late in the day at the convention to say, let's have an electoral college, which is essentially mirroring Congress. Every state gets the same representation in this college as you get in Congress. So it looks the same in terms of the representation bargain we already have. But then those people in each state are chosen by the states, and they elect a president. And then we've solved some of the separation of powers problems. If you want to have a popular election, that's great. That's up to you states to try to figure it out. So there's a lot of reasons, kind of maybe strange reasons why there was the opposition to a popular election, and then it translates into this sort of electoral college that we get today. So we don't directly elect the president. We choose electors who elect the president. But I think when we think about some of those reasons today, obviously, the justification for slaveholding states doesn't really hold water anymore since the Civil War. The notion that the people wouldn't be able to identify who a good presidential candidate would be doesn't really hold water anymore. We know who the presidential candidates are far more than we know most other members running for Congress or anything like that.
Too much.
Maybe a little bit too much. And so we can think about the notion that smaller states feel that they have more protection in the Electoral College. States like Wyoming and Vermont, even though there's not a lot of attention paid to them by the presidential candidates, maybe they get a little more influence, just like they get a little more influence in the Senate because the Electoral College resembles that. But a couple things to think about the Electoral College and its advantages today. One is it requires broad geographic support. You have to win in a lot of places across the United States. Now, maybe you say that's not as important as winning the majority or the plurality of the popular vote, but at least if we're thinking about trade-offs for political representation, that's one justification. Another is it reflects the reality of how elections run in the United States. States run elections. So we could think about a presidential election run nationally, but I think it would take a really significant transformation of how we think about elections. It would really require consistent ballot access rules, consistent absentee ballot rules, consistency across the states, because it would be very strange for us to have a presidential election with 51 different ways of running it. So there's an advantage in that the Electoral College still reflects how states are primarily responsible for running elections, just like they run elections for senator, for House, for governor, whatever it might be. And then we add up all of those things into these electors who then vote for the president. So there are probably some justifications, obviously contested as we think about other things, but some of those justifications from the framing certainly don't hold water today.
Let me just ask you before I turn to Amanda, just if you could give us 2 minutes, like you said, the representation mirrors the representation in the House and Senate. Could you just explain a little more about what that means? Like, how do we determine how many Electoral College votes California gets compared to Indiana or New Jersey?
Sure. Right. So one of the great compromises at the convention was that there would be 2 chambers of Congress, The House of Representatives would be apportioned based on population and 3/5 of the enslaved population. And obviously, since the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery, that provision doesn't apply today. But we count based on the total population in each state. So if you have 200,000 people, you get twice the representation of a state that has 100,000 people. So that's the House of Representatives. It's capped at 435 by statute, but you have that side. And then the other chambers, the Senate, every state gets 2 members, regardless of your size. Vermont, Wyoming, California, Texas. Everyone gets 2. When you add those up, every state gets at least 2 senators. Every state has at least 1 member of the House. So every state gets at least 3 members representing them in Congress. And likewise, every state is going to get that same representation in the Electoral College, at least 3 members representing them in the Electoral College. And the District of Columbia, which was given electoral votes under the 23rd Amendment, gets as many electoral votes as the smallest state, so 3 electoral votes in this case, which gives us our 538 electoral votes, which looks like the 535 members in Congress, plus the 3 for D.C.
And just one more background question, because I realize we should get these facts on the table. So say it takes 270 to win, assuming every state submits their Electoral College votes. What happens if no candidate gets a majority, or if there's a 269 tie, which is something that we've heard about? We may talk a little bit about that as we go on tonight, because there were some questions about a single Electoral College vote in Nebraska. So can you just explain that part first, about how states allocate their votes?
Sure. So states get to kind of do whatever they want with their electoral votes. We all have popular elections for them. In 48 states in D.C., it's winner take all. You win 1 vote more than your opponent, you get all of that state's electoral votes. But in 2 states, Maine and Nebraska, you get 2 electoral votes for winning the statewide election, just like the senators are elected statewide. And then you get 1 electoral vote per congressional district. So Maine has 2 congressional districts. In previous elections, Joe Biden won 1 electoral vote. Donald Trump wins 1 electoral vote. In Nebraska, you could have Mitt Romney winning 2 electoral votes and Barack Obama winning 1 electoral vote, because there's 3 congressional districts. So it's a different way of awarding the electoral votes, but a way that states are permitted to do. Most of them like winner take all, because it makes the state much more attractive for candidates to campaign there, because it's a large pot of votes. Or in safe states, maybe like California or Alabama, it's an incentive to sort of give those votes to maybe the candidate you prefer, rather than dividing them up in some other way. If nobody gets a majority, or if there's a tie, the election is sent to the House of Representatives in what's known as a contingent election. This has not happened since 1824. Very gratefully, that has not happened since then, because then it goes to the House that chooses either among the tied candidates or the top 3 candidates, if there's no one that gets a majority. And the House votes, and each state gets 1 vote. California gets 1 vote, Texas gets 1 vote, Wyoming gets 1 vote, Vermont gets 1 vote. You need 26 states to win in the House, and that requires a majority of the delegation. So if your delegation, like Minnesota right now, is divided evenly, 4-4, 5-5, I don't remember what it is, that doesn't count toward the majority. So you need 26 votes. And right now, Republicans control exactly 26 delegations. Democrats control 22, and 2 of them are evenly divided. But obviously, that might change by this November and the changing the composition of the House.
Thank you, and sorry for that pop quiz there, but I figured we should get some of these.
Doing okay so far.
I think I saw that episode of Veep. I don't know if anybody else saw that.
That's right. One thing about the Electoral College is that it doesn't follow the normal 1 person, 1 vote rule, where every person gets the same representation. It instead is representation, as Derek said, by states. So I want to turn to you, Amanda, and ask you more of the normative question, which is, today, not back in the 1780s, but today, is the Electoral College a fair way to hold a presidential election in the United States? And how do we evaluate fairness? How do we think about such a question? And why is it that conservatives right now tend to like the Electoral College more than liberals? And is that like a endemic fact, or is that something that might change over time?
Yeah, thanks, Rick. So you may have noticed I am the non-lawyer on the panel. I don't do election law. I'm moonlighting here as a political scientist. So what I'm going to try to do is sort of give like the 30,000-foot view, right? And sort of inject the question of politics in here. So to answer your question, Rick, no. No, it's not a fair way to hold presidential elections, and I want to explain what I mean by that. And I say that as a constitutional scholar, as a political scientist, but also I'm the vice president of our local chapter of the League of Women Voters. And the League of Women Voters' position is unequivocal on this, and it's no. So why? The Electoral College overrepresents states at the expense of people for the reasons that we just talked about. It overrepresents and overinflates the importance of a handful of states at the expense of reliably Democratic or Republican states. It makes voters in safe states feel like their votes don't matter. And we know this from multiple studies in political science that states that will matter in the next election get not only more visits and more attention, they also get more funding, more disaster relief, which is a timely thing to talk about given what's happening on the East Coast at the moment. And they get more policy attention. So the perceived interests of people in these electorally competitive states are overrepresented not just in campaigning, but also in actual governance. Also consider that every other presidential democracy in the world, including those that modeled their earliest efforts on the American system, did away with indirect elections during the 20th century. But here in the United States, despite hundreds of attempts to reform or abolish the Electoral College, we're still stuck with it. And it's not just about electing the president. You asked how we evaluate whether the Electoral College is fair or not. And I think we have to evaluate the system in light of all the ways the president, who is not guaranteed to represent a majority of voters in this system, gets to govern and what that means for the American people. So under the Electoral College, twice since I reached voting age, in the year 2000 and in the year 2016, Americans have been governed by and under a president that did not represent the majority of voters. I think this is particularly important now, more so when this happened in the late 1800s, for a few reasons. First off, the president has so much more power today than the president had in the late 1800s, and more power than most of the founding fathers would have envisioned a president could have. We can think here of the growth of the modern administrative state and the modern presidency. And that means a minority of voters may get to say who heads the Environmental Protection Agency, Health and Human Services, the Food and Drug Administration, Department of Education, Department of Justice, and all the ways these agencies govern and affect contemporary life in America. Do we have clean water? Do we have health care that covers reproductive choice, access to fair housing, protections from eviction, a curriculum that erases slavery, a Justice Department that will prosecute criminal behavior in government, or one that will look the other way? And I also want to think here about how polarization and divided government, there's some good political science terms for you, have further incentivized unilateral executive action. So we can think here about executive orders on everything from immigration to student debt relief to climate action. If you watched the VP debate a few weeks ago, you heard J.D. Vance bragging about how Donald Trump, a president who lost the popular vote by almost 3 million, had issued more than 60 executive orders on immigration at the border, all without the People's Branch weighing in, and all while representing and carrying out an agenda that did not and does not align with the majority of what Americans want. And finally, on this point, I have to talk about the Supreme Court and the federal courts more generally, but the Supreme Court and the power that the president has to install justices on the country's highest court that do not, and emphatically do not, represent the legal and constitutional vision of America. To give just one example, and I could cite dozens, of the 5 justices who voted to overturn Roe versus Wade in 2022, 4 of them were appointed by a president who lost the popular vote. This, to me, is damning of our current system. For reasons I explored at great length in my 2020 congressional testimony and my 2022 testimony to the Biden Commission on the Supreme Court, the appointment of judges and justices gives some presidents, by chance, luck, or lottery, the ability to shape American politics for up to 3 decades. So for all these reasons, the Electoral College is not a fair way to pick a president, but more importantly, it facilitates unfair, unpopular, minoritarian governance for at least 4 years. And if that president has the good fortune to, say, appoint 1/3 of the Supreme Court of the United States during those 4 years, it locks the country into a continued fate of unfair, unpopular, and minoritarian rule for up to 30 years. So why do conservatives seem to like it? I'd reframe this question as, why do Republicans like the Electoral College? Because it's really not a conservative liberal thing. It's very much a partisan thing. And the answer is simple: power. So the Electoral College is one of several elements in our constitutional design that have afforded what Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt refer to as constitutional protectionism for the Republican Party, allowing them to stay electorally competitive and win power despite having a narrow, aging demographic and a nationally unpopular party platform. By leveraging the minoritarian features of our constitutional design, the Republican Party has not had to adjust its platform or its priorities to accommodate an increasingly diverse electoral demographic in order to stay competitive. And it's not just the Electoral College, of course, that's enabled what Levitsky and Ziblatt called the tyranny of minority in the United States. We can think also of the Senate, the filibuster, single-member districts and winner-take-all elections, and of course control of the courts that have handed down decisions since 2010 that have gutted the Voting Rights Act, making it harder for black and brown voters, allowed restrictive voting laws to go into effect, opened the door for more money in elections, and given the green light for partisan gerrymandering, among other Republican-favoring decisions. We can also think about the difficulty of amending the Constitution itself as contributing to the destructive tyranny of the minority. We have the single hardest Constitution to amend in the world, according to the index of difficulty. And we exceed, it's a thing, the index of difficulty. And we exceed the next highest scoring countries, Australia and Switzerland, by a wide margin. So the bottom line is, if subjected to a national referendum and a national vote, the Republican Party would lose every time. And these losses would force it to change, to adapt, and become more representative of American voters and their preferences in order to remain competitive in national elections. But they don't have to, because our constitutional system protects them and allows them to eke out victories through the Electoral College and continue to wield power. So that's where we are in 2024. And for all these reasons, both in my capacity as a constitutional scholar and the vice president of my local chapter of the League of Women Voters, I'll just say simply that it's time to abolish the Electoral College.
I want to follow up just on one small point, maybe not such a small point, before turning to Joey, which has to do with the comparison of the popular vote to the Electoral College vote. And of course, if you're a candidate now, you don't need to run up the popular vote in California or Florida. I don't know if you saw the poll this morning showing Donald Trump with a 13-point lead in Florida in the New York Times poll. You might act as a candidate for office very differently if you were trying to run the popular vote. So do we really, how much weight can we give to this discrepancy between the popular vote, which is essentially a beauty contest in the current system, because it has no legal effect, and what the popular vote might look like if we actually held a national vote for president?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't thought through the counterfactual. Of course, that candidates would change their strategies. They'd focus on more populous states. California would all of a sudden become very, very popular. When we had wildfire emergencies, a Republican president wouldn't tell us just to rake our forests, right? They'd pay attention. They might give us more disaster relief. So it's going to change the calculus, not just for campaigning, but it's going to change the calculus for governing. And I think that's one of the key ways that I think, yes, we're talking about electing a president, but also I'm concerned about the ways that that impacts governing and representation under our democracy. So I don't know the answer to that question. It could be that changes in tactics would mean the popular vote would sway more towards Republicans, that they'd be forced. But the key is they'd actually be forced to court voters, right? Instead of sort of insulating themselves and targeting a smaller electoral college victory.
Thank you. Joey, our friend Heather Gerken, the dean of the Yale Law School, talks about the here to there problem. You may sit in your office, in your ivory tower. My tower is not so ivory. It's kind of a tower in our building. But we can conjure up the world's best reforms, but they're not so easy to enact for partly for reasons that Amanda's talked about. What are the alternatives to the Electoral College, and how might we get there, if not in my lifetime, maybe in the lifetime of your children?
Oh, well, that's a little dark. Like how far out do we have to look? I want to say one thing about where you just ended in your exchange with Amanda first, because I think one of the questions that you framed at the beginning of this is the Electoral College a fair way to elect a president? But another thing we could ask is just, is it a good way? And one of the values that I think we should consider, not just fairness, but democracy. I mean, if you want to see what a democratically engaged campaign for president looks like, all you have to do is leave California and go to any swing state or to Omaha, Nebraska, which for the reasons that Derek was explaining actually counts, and so has a robust campaign, and people are getting their neighbors out to vote, and people are having debates and talking about what this election means to them, and trying to get their completely disengaged relatives to stop looking at confusing conspiracy theories and actually pay attention and vote. All this is happening in 7 states and Omaha. And so the way that we could have a national version of that is if we had a national popular vote. But of course we don't. So it's very hard to get there from here. My honest view, just to cut to the end, and then I'll say a little more in the middle, but we'll get a national popular vote when the Republican Party and the Democratic Party both want a national popular vote. And I think that might happen when and if Texas turns blue, which, as a Texan, I've been told throughout my entire life that within 10 or 15 years, Texas might turn blue. And I think it's still about 10 or 15 years away. So we'll see about that. But that would reverse who had the advantage in the Electoral College. And then the Electoral College would be of benefit electorally, to Democrats over Republicans. And I suspect that might help scramble things enough that we could start having a conversation in which both parties might see potential advantage. There's a lot of Republican votes in Staten Island that are not being engaged. There's a lot of Democrats in Houston. Nobody cares about them. There's a lot of potential votes out there that the parties could try to get and could see a path to victory. So that's the big political story. But, I'm a lawyer. You probably want to hear the law story. The law story is very difficult. I mean, I don't know too much about exactly where we stand on the index, but I'm certain that it is something between yikes and this is actually impossible. So it's very, very difficult to amend the Constitution.
Can you just remind us what it takes to amend the Constitution?
Yes. First, you need a supermajority vote in Congress, 2/3 of the House and the Senate, and then you need 3/4 of the states to approve your amendment. So you don't have supermajorities of that size very often. I think it's very plausible to imagine that someday in the future, if both parties decided that the Electoral College was potentially something that needed to be changed, which currently is emphatically not the case for all the reasons that Amanda just discussed, you might have a majority and not a supermajority in favor of this change, at which point it would start to get interesting. So one effort currently getting a fair amount of attention is this National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. This idea trades on the point that Derek made at the beginning, which is that states can choose how to award their electoral votes more or less how they want. So the idea behind this compact is a lot of states, if states representing a majority of all the electoral votes agreed to give the electoral votes to the winner of the national popular vote, then they could just do that, and then the winner of the national popular vote would get the presidency. So that's the concept. I think it's actually a little bit more of an organizing tool and a kind of spur toward getting people to think about the popular vote than it is a practical strategy in a world where one of the political parties wants to keep the Electoral College, because you're not going to get Republicans choosing to join this compact until that political reality changes. There are also some problems with how the compact would play out if it was a really close run thing. There are questions about what if a state tried to leave the compact after they had joined, but right before the election, and there are problems. There are ways to try to get around this. Much would depend on how hostile are the courts to this compact, which currently the answer would be very. So I think while this effort is, I think, a laudable effort to get Americans to think about this topic of changing to a national popular vote, I think it's sort of a step on the road or a way station toward actually getting a different political reality in which the national popular vote ceases to be a sort of Democratic Party versus Republican Party thing and becomes something that the American political system can sort of seriously consider doing. I think it can really only happen, I guess there's sort of two ways. One is you can imagine, if Democrats had sweeping FDR-like majorities, perhaps they could make this level of change. I don't think that's likely at all. And so instead, the likelihood would be, I think, running through blue Texas and then Republicans deciding that maybe it was in their interest to change to a national popular vote.
I want to follow up on that last point for a minute because I try not to obsessively read the Nate Cohn column in the New York Times about polling, but I find myself drawn to it. And one of the things he talks about a lot is that the gap between the popular vote and the Electoral College vote seems to potentially be shrinking. And one of the things we know is that Democrats have made inroads with college-educated voters, white voters who used to tend to vote more for the Republican Party, and Republicans are making inroads with working-class voters. And the party coalitions are shifting. And Amanda, you may want to weigh on this too with your political science hat on. So might there be a moment where the parties are actually competitive in the popular vote, and there could be this chance for amendment?
Well, I think you're talking about two different things. So you're right. There could be a moment, and I hope that we are in one, where the parties are as competitive in the popular vote as they are in the Electoral College. I don't think it's good at all that, it was one thing when in 2000 there was a small difference between the popular vote and the Electoral College, and essentially Florida was tied. It's quite another thing when you have a gap of 3 million votes, as happened last time. That's really quite striking. And I think I'm hopeful. I don't know enough about whether the polling people have any idea what they're doing this cycle to be sure whether the gap between the popular vote and the Electoral College is shrinking. But you're right, there's some evidence of that. I think that would be good, but I think that would still be a far cry from, unfortunately, from the partisan ideologies regarding the topic of the Electoral College to shift. I think that would require a real change where Republicans actually come to see a better route toward victory through the popular vote. Imagining, okay, we've lost Texas, but we can actually get out the vote of a lot of Republicans in Orange County. Like that mindset is what we would need, I think, to actually get this change.
Amanda.
So in 2012, when the Republicans lost, when Mitt Romney lost to Barack Obama, there was a moment in the Republican Party where they said, we need a new strategy, right? We need to tone down the rhetoric on immigration. We need to be sort of a more welcoming party. We need to cast a wider net, or we're not going to become electorally competitive. We're not going to bring in more people to the Republican Party. And very famously, Paul Ryan is sort of running around and trying to convince party elites and leaders, and also Rush Limbaugh and people who control talk radio, people who control Fox News, that this is where the party has to go. And Limbaugh and the Fox News folks said, no, we're not going to go that way, right? No way. I can't bring this to my voters, right? And so the Republican Party's strategy became targeting, mobilizing over, in large part, racial resentment, fears around immigration, and mobilizing their predominantly aging but white population in electorally viable states. And so it was a move, and it was a conscious move to sort of restrict and narrow and then message on grievance, racial resentment, white supremacy. And that is what the Republican Party strategy has been. I am somebody who wants to see a better Republican Party. I think we as a country need, and I would very much embrace, a Republican Party that stopped the white supremacist rhetoric, that stopped that divisive rhetoric, because that is the rhetoric that leads to violence. And when we think about the fate of American democracy right now, that is my real fear, right? It's not that the Democrats might lose under a new system. It's that we have one party that is, because of its strategy, stoking violence. And so the stakes become so high for every election. And that, I think, is what is the real problem with the current system.
So I think I've heard something very different from Joey and Amanda compared to Derek about how to think about the function of the Electoral College. And one of the things, Derek, I think I heard from you was that it's a way for states to be represented. And I want to probe this a little more, as opposed to thinking about it as Democrats versus Republicans, as the question of, like, do we think of ourselves as primarily residents or citizens of our states first and the country second? Or, like, how do we think about representation today when we live in this federalist system where we are both citizens of the United States and residents of our particular state? And maybe ideologically speaking, putting aside the kind of the raw partisan politics that we've heard, maybe ideologically speaking, part of the divide about the Electoral College is about thinking about, I don't want to use the term states' rights because it's very loaded, but thinking about representation through states as opposed to representations of people, all people in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, there are loaded ways of thinking about it. I think there's no question that we think of ourselves probably more as American than we might have in previous eras, where we think of ourselves more as residents of a state, and particularly in eras where we were less transient or less likely to move, where you had a much more attachment to the local affinity. But at the same time, there's something very powerful, I think, people talking about they want to move to California or out of California, right? Those are
lately out of California.
I mean, those are things, right? And it's not. There's reasons why people want to move in, and there are reasons why people want to move out. So there is a sense that there's a geographic attachment that we're attaching not to Los Angeles County and Ventura County and Orange County in the same way that we're thinking about Texas and Arizona and California and Oregon. So when we're thinking about those needs too, I think the needs of California are distinct, and I think we think about those sometimes, whether it's immigration or the environment or whatever it might be. You know, Texas's views on energy policy, Pennsylvania's views on fracking, right? There are these geographic attachments that we have. Again, I think we can think about those in terms of cobbling together these states that do have significant power and autonomy, unlike many other places in the world where the sort of geographic subunits are just something else. They're just sort of ways of attaching or dividing up or sort of administering the government, much like counties or municipality borders might be. But if we're thinking about the states as representing something else, and especially in terms of their ability to govern as the principal place where things like criminal law and the administration of the education system and things like that are happening principally at the state level, I think there are these interests that are being reflected state by state. Now, again, we might evaluate it at the end of the day and say trade-off's not worth it. I think we just want to evaluate everybody's preferences across the United States and aggregate them and figure out what they look like. But to the extent we think there's something there, I think we should be thinking about those rules of states to some degree. And we think about that. That's how we apportion the House of Representatives. That's how we apportion the Senate. I mean, they're based partially on statehood. Even the House of Representatives, everyone gets one representative, and we parcel them out, sort of spreading out around the rest of the United States, even though that's the most democratic branch and the one most closely attached to the people. So again, I think there are trade-offs in this, but I do think there's something to be, gained by recognizing some of those unique values that states have today.
To the extent that I wonder how much states can serve as a check. So I think of how California reacted to Trump, how Texas reacts to Biden, how the Ninth Circuit responds, which is the court for the Western areas, and how the Fifth Circuit responds. I don't know if you could create a theory of federalism, since we used to think of separation of powers, like Congress is the check on the president. Well, when the Congress and the president are the same party, they're not much of a check at all. Maybe states are playing this role. I don't know if there's a justification in there for state-based representation.
Yeah, I mean,
Come to you next.
it almost means you don't even, it's something else outside of the Electoral College almost, right? It's something outside of what's happening in D.C. Because a lot of these things that are happening in the states, sometimes they're by statutes, right? We might think about California passing a statute relating to AI in elections, or Texas passing a statute regarding political speech on Facebook or whatever it might be. Sometimes this is happening by statute, but it's a lot of times it's just states running into federal court suing the executive, and just suing 100 times. I think California hit 100 in the Trump administration. I don't know if Texas has. I imagine it would want to hit 101 by the end of the Biden administration, right? There's something a little sad about that in my judgment. It's not how we typically think about who's supposed to be checking the executive. We can think about the courts maybe sometimes doing that, but it really should be the legislature. And the legislature has atrophied to such a degree that we're thinking about the states as being the place to do it, but not really the states. It's the states asking the federal courts to do it. So I think it's a way of thinking about this geographic disparity across the United States in terms of how they are playing a role or a check, as the losing side in the Electoral College. But in some ways, it's kind of I hate to say depressing way of thinking as a check.
Well, we need an index of depression as well. Joey, one of the things I heard Derek say when he was talking about the state system was saying, well, we've got the Senate. And it seems to me the Senate is probably a bigger problem when it comes to the issue of representation than the Electoral College in terms of deviations from the one person, one vote rule. You've written about this one person, one vote rule. Do you see the Electoral College as a unique problem, or is it part of a series of minoritarian kinds of features of the U.S. Democratic system?
Right. So in the 1960s, the United States decided that actually it wasn't okay to have our states run by a few people who had sort of landed gentry-like existence in rural counties where they could elect. It used to be before the 1960s, for much of the 20th century, that a small number of people in a rural place might have the same number of representatives in their state house as an entire big city. And this was just how it was. It was part of why civil rights was so difficult in much of the South. And the Supreme Court, the Warren Court, in a series of decisions, decided, this is the one person, one vote cases, that this wasn't okay, and that actually it violated the equal protection of the laws of the people who live in the state, and that you had to have equal numbers of representatives for equal numbers of people, a rule that conspicuously the Senate violates. And in fact, many states tried to make this argument. They said, oh, well, look, we just have, it's like a little bit like the U.S. Senate, what we're doing in our state. Each county gets one senator or something like that. And the court said, no, you can't do that. The U.S. Senate is an exception because that's in the Constitution, but obviously you can't do it because it violates the equal protection of the laws, obviously. And so we just have this strange state of affairs where the courts enforce down to the school board level a rule that everyone has to follow one person, one vote, but then the most important elected body in the country, the Senate, blatantly doesn't follow it because of compromises made in 1789. So I guess the good news for the topic of this evening is that the Electoral College is only the second most difficult to change feature of our constitutional system that has undemocratic elements. The Senate, you can't even change through Article 5, even if you had a supermajority big enough to use Article 5. The only way to make the Senate less undemocratic is through admitting new states, or getting a new constitution. So
Or amending the Constitution to get rid of that part of the Constitution.
That's right. There's various strategies. Or, having a Schmenit instead of the Senate and having, there's all kinds of workaround. But, basically the realistic answer is that, Rick, your question has made the Electoral College, by comparison, look quite tractable and like a solvable problem.
I'll only add, not only is the Senate probably the most undemocratic institution, but it also has its own minority governance rules now under the filibuster. And so that is something that in order to add new states, you would need to eliminate the filibuster because you're not going to have a supermajority in the Senate, right? So it requires supermajorities to do anything, even in this already fundamentally skewed institution. So if we can't eliminate the Electoral College tonight, maybe we should think about the filibuster just as an entree, like a little appetizer.
Consolation prize.
Yeah.
Well, I think we might see the elimination of the filibuster once we again have united control of Congress and the presidency, but maybe. We'll see. So I will be coming to the audience for questions, but I want to turn to what I consider to be a very important, somewhat separate topic from what we've been talking about, which is the question of whether the Electoral College serves as a kind of bulwark against the subversion of elections, assuring the peaceful transition of power, or actually serves to facilitate it. Derek mentioned earlier that Article 2 tells states that they can choose their method for appointing presidential electors, and it gives state legislatures the power to set the manner for doing so. And we were reminded, if you go back and read the Supreme Court's opinion in Bush versus Gore, the case that ended the dispute over the 2000 election, the court says that, as Derek mentioned, every state has given the power to the voters to vote for president to be able to choose electors, but state legislatures could take back that power in future elections at any time. And what we saw in the 2020 election was some variation on that, where there were attempts after the election to try to argue that state legislatures had the power to take that back. So maybe, Derek, if you could just tell us, how does the Electoral College either raise the risks or lower the risks? And if maybe you could talk a little bit about the Electoral Count Reform Act and how that's changed the calculus on those risks, just to get all that on the table.
Sure. So, when I think about, again, running a presidential election, and maybe others have different thoughts about running a presidential election at the federal level, right? I mentioned earlier you would have to have federal control, I think, over the elections, that you have a consistently administered election rather than 51 separate elections and then trying to figure out how we add those things up. And again, to me, it makes a lot of sense. We have consistent absentee rules, consistent voter qualifications. The ballot looks the same from Maine to Hawaii. But that's the separate challenge is you have to have create a federal agency to run elections. I don't know how people would have felt if Donald Trump's running the presidential election in 2020. Would have been, I think, an interesting way of thinking about how we're running elections at the federal level and what kind of agencies that looks like or how we create levels of separation. So we can think about states doing it, and there are consequences, obviously. People might have their thoughts in Arizona and Georgia and Michigan and Wisconsin and whatever it might be. But there are ways of thinking about how states administer presidential elections, and they're somewhat siloed off from what the federal government is doing. So there is that separation, I think, that can add some value. It can add some tension, obviously, because now you have 50 places where things can go wrong. And depending on the state, depending on the legislature, and depending on the makeup, there's different challenges. So one of those things that came out of this election, of the 2020 election, after the election, is that there's a federal statute that was put in place in 1845 that said, if the election is supposed to be the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November for the president. And Article 2 says Congress can pick that date. But in 1845, they added a provision that says, but if the state has failed to make a choice on that day, it may do so later. And that sounds odd, but in 1845, the notion was some states had a runoff that you needed a majority in the state, and if you didn't get a majority but just a plurality, you would have to go later and have a majority vote to choose the presidential electors, and then they would vote. So there was like this contingency built in that a state like New Hampshire had at the time. States got rid of that. Nobody's really used it in a very long time. But you have this language in the Constitution or in the federal law there was kind of like this loaded gun that in 2020 people said, states failed to make a choice because of reasons, because of fraud, because of whatever it might be. And so if they fail to make a choice, the legislature can step in later and do it. And Congress looked at that language and realized that's not true, right? In 2020, all 50 states made a choice. They all had a popular election. They all voted. There was a canvass. There was a choice made. And the legislature doesn't get to show up later and say, oh, that wasn't a real choice. Like we made the choice. So Congress in 2022, when it passed the Electoral Count Reform Act, tried to clean up some of the things that happened from 2020. And one of those things was to take out some of that, take out that language in particular and say, no. There's one election day. The laws have to be in place before election day. So the legislature cannot show up later and say, we have a different day of choosing electors, and the legislature can't show up later and change the rules for how we're appointing electors. So those are just a couple of things, again, knowing that the states have this flexibility, but trying to address and limit some of the ambiguity that was thrown around in 2020 that might have muddied the waters.
Let me turn to Joey and then to Amanda and ask kind of a similar version of this question. Are you confident that the Electoral College system is going to help assure that we have a peaceful transition of power and a free and fair election in 2024? Is it a hindrance, or is it really, that's not even the right question to ask about the question of how secure our democracy is?
The counterfactual is a little tricky because I actually agree with Derek that if you had a national popular vote system, already we have quite a lot of federal regulation of state elections and federal elections that take place in and are run by states. And I think that would have to be more if you were trying to get a national federal count and you wanted everybody to agree on how many votes were cast everywhere. There would be more layers of federal election regulation coming in. I think that would it would help limit the Bush v. Gore problem. The chances that the national popular vote is within 500 votes or 300 votes or whatever, depending how you count, is very low. If that happened, of course, things would get a little crazy, but I think that's much less likely than having one state be essentially tied or within the margin of error. In terms of this question of subversion, though, I do think the present system of giving lots of power to state legislatures to choose their electors, I think the Reform Act was a great step, but it remains a problem that sometimes you have a state legislature that is not in partisan agreement with the voters of the state. And there's a lot of temptation in that situation, and not just temptation, but political pressure from a certain presidential candidate's allies to try something, just see if a court will let you do it, try sending an alternate slate of electors, that sort of thing. That's only possible because of the Electoral College.
So, Amanda, I want to just a little bit of a variation on this, and then I'm going to come to the audience for questions, and there'll be people coming around. You'll raise your hand with microphones so you can ask your question. So one of the things I think we learned or was underlined by what we saw in 2020 is that, putting aside, do we like the Electoral College or not, the mechanics of how we translate voters' votes into a state's Electoral College votes, it goes through a lot of layers, including local election boards, state certifying bodies, secretaries of state, governors play a role, and then it goes to Congress, and the vice president's up there, and that's another thing that was clarified, that the vice president doesn't have this power in that electoral count. But now Speaker of the House Mike Johnson was asked, "Are you going to accept the results of a certified election?" He said, "If it's free and fair." That's just another layer. And so I wonder how we should think about not the Electoral College itself, but how we operationalize the choice of electors for the Electoral College.
Yeah, Rick, that's such an important question when you're saying free and fair elections and peaceful transition of power. I immediately was like, well, we can parse those things out as two different questions. We could have free and fair elections objectively, empirically, and still not have a peaceful transition of power. I don't know the answer if more layers of accountability increase or decrease the perception that the election was stolen. If you are convinced that your candidate wins or the election is stolen, I don't know how many layers of accountability you can put in that would assuage that fear. I think it doesn't help when you have one party's elites going around refusing to acknowledge the validity of the 2020 election. I mean, everybody, if you didn't watch the VP debate, you saw the gotcha moment where Tim Walz turns and says, so you're saying, will you acknowledge that the 2020 election, was valid? And he just said, I'm looking towards the future. That kind of rhetoric is really, really dangerous. So I think, we shouldn't be focusing on layers of accountability. I think those matter for the empirical question of was the election free and fair, but for whether or not we're going to have a peaceful transfer of power, Republican elites need to stop being what Levitsky and Ziblatt called semi-loyal Democrats, right? With a small d. Small d, semi-loyal Democrats with a small d. These are people who are not actively trying to undermine democracy, but they're sitting idly by while other members of the Republican elite sort of generate fear and suspicion around democracy and around voting, right? So it would take, I think, party leaders and party elites to step up and say with conviction, this was a free and fair election.
Well, I've got more questions, but I want to see if there are any audience questions. And we have lights shining very brightly in our eyes, so we can't really see if there are questions. There are, great.
Hi, I have a argument to present in favor of
let's
the
try and keep
Electoral
them as
College.
questions if we can.
I'm wondering if the experts could chime in and speak on if the existence of the Electoral College allowed for experimentation of voting in the states and state-based elections really allowed for minorities like women and Black people to begin to vote and be represented at the state level. I'm just wondering how our experts would react to that, being that that's pointed out. I wonder if keeping it flexible within the states makes it fair when the federal government hasn't caught up, which we spoke about how it's difficult for the federal government to enact change. It's an interesting argument that I've had brought up by conservatives, and I don't know how to respond, and I'm wondering what our experts say to that.
Joey?
Well, sure. It's a bit of a non sequitur, I think, because the enfranchisement of women in the states is it completely independent of the Electoral College. States have a full system of elections. And, many of the states here in the West were early on the train before the federal government did it, of enfranchising women. I think it's an ill-chosen example for that argument to bring up the enfranchisement of Black people, because in the end, most of the Black people in this country were only enfranchised because of the Civil War and the invasion of their states by the federal government, which overthrew a more state-based system and put in the national system of citizenship that we have today.
Next question.
Hi. Derek mentioned that the Electoral College is based on the congressional delegations. Now, 100 years ago, they limited the size of the House of Representatives. Would it be an easier way to, say, double or triple the size of the House of Representatives? In that case, California would get an extra 61 electoral count votes, where Wyoming would only get 1, and that would bring it more towards the popular vote?
Oh, I'm all for it. I'm all for a 7,000 member House. I have an op-ed in the Detroit News a few months ago. Representative Andrew Fink of Michigan introduced a proposal to amend the Constitution that James Madison had originally proposed on this very issue. This is wonky stuff, right? Danielle Allen at Harvard has written a little bit about this too. There are proposals to what it's called uncap the House. And the notion is we've been in this place for 100 years. 435 was just kind of this negotiated agreement due to this fight that happened in the 19-teens and 1920s. And so now we have districts with 1 million people for one representative. It's very hard for them to travel, to advertise, to have the constituent services that we might want, to be able to relate to people, to be able to have a grassroots campaign. So there's all kinds of, I think, benefits to increasing the size of the House. On its own. I think we're thinking about more oversight. If we're worried about the federal bureaucracy or worrying about the executive doing things on his own, maybe we want more congressional oversight and more members of Congress thinking about legislation. Now, of course, my friends in D.C. say there's no place to put that many people and their staff, and maybe that's a separate issue to talk about. And so that's, I think, an interesting thing. But I think it's right that you diminish some of the disproportionality between large and small states by having more members in the House, which are based on total population, which is closer to what we want for the Electoral College. And to be fair, of course, it's the same kinds of problems about they're only still going to focus on a handful of swing states. That's a legitimate concern, right? And so it doesn't cure everything, but it cures at least some of those problems. And I think if you looked at some of the mismatches in past elections, you might not see them either as dramatic or even happen at all if you were to have a larger House of Representatives.
Next question, please.
How can you justify California voting for no voter ID?
It's a little bit off the topic of today's conversation. I don't know if do any of the panelists want to weigh in on that, or we can just take another question related to the Electoral College.
I'll just say historically, voter ID laws have not been to maintain election integrity. We know that there are empirically close to 0 cases of voter fraud, but they have been used to create barriers and obstacles, in large part to voters, minority voters, low-income voters, and voters of color. And so I think in a state like California, that's acknowledged. The history of voter ID laws often go hand in hand with voter suppression.
I'll just say that as a point of the moderator's privilege that in my recent book I called for national universal voter registration and national voter ID, and I like to say it's a proposal that unites Democrats and Republicans because they all hate it. Next question, please.
My question goes back to the potential tie in the Electoral College. I know everybody's shaking their heads, but
That goes to the misery index, yes.
yes,
Or the Veep scenario.
It was in Veep.
it's potentially viable. So the question is, which Congress votes, the sitting Congress or the new Congress that's sworn in on January 1st?
So it's the new Congress. This didn't always used to be the case. It used to be the old Congress that would count electoral votes. But since we switched, because it used to be everybody took office on March 4th, so you had the old Congress counting electoral votes ahead of the new president. Now, it doesn't have to be that way. You could imagine Congress changing the date of counting electoral votes. Right now, it's picked January 6th. It's not arbitrary, but it's just been in the law for a long time. It's 2 weeks before January 20th. It gives time for the House to choose a president if there's a need to. It gives time for a presidential transition when you have that certainty and for them to be able to send their picks to the Senate and the Senate be able to start nominating the Attorney General and Secretary of State. But once you bake in something like January 6th where you say it's after, sometimes that's fallen on a Sunday and Congress has moved it around to January 8th and things like that, but it's always kept it after January 3rd where you have the new Congress. So once we change the start dates for Congress to January 3rd and the presidency January 20th, Congress has moved that date for the new Congress.
That question reminds me of the machinations that we saw about the second congressional district in Omaha, Nebraska. Joey, I don't know if you could just fill us in on what happened there and maybe what that says about at least how we think about how states allocate their electoral college votes?
Sure, yeah. I mean, the thing that states have is a fair amount of flexibility, actually, although all the states except two, as Derek mentioned, are exercising it in the same way. But because there's this possibility that Nebraska, which is a red state that will vote for Trump in next month, would nonetheless give one electoral vote from Omaha to Kamala Harris, there was national pressure. Republicans, Senator Lindsey Graham, and other sort of national figures were lobbying their Nebraska counterparts to consider changing their system to winner take all, because then that would be one more vote, one more Republican vote, one fewer vote for the Democrat. At which point, legislators in Maine started to say, well, if you change to winner take all, we'll change to winner take all and offset your advantage. At which point it became seemingly a dead issue. And then mysteriously, just after a legislatively self-imposed deadline in Maine that would have prevented Maine from easily changing its system, as soon as that deadline passed, there was a renewed effort to get the Nebraska side to try to make their move, perhaps boxing out Maine, although I'm a little skeptical that Maine wouldn't have found some way if this really happened. And the Nebraska Republican legislators, dealing with their own internal dynamics, eventually fell slightly short. There was basically a Republican who happened to be from Omaha, who said,
Who wants to run for mayor of Omaha?
Yes, and whose voters in Omaha would probably not much like the change. He said what I thought sounded like a very uncontroversial good government statement, where he said, I've considered it quite a lot. One can only imagine how his phone blew up over that day or week. I've considered it quite a lot, and I think now is not the moment to make this kind of a change, right before the election, and we're leaving it at that. So, the only reason I'm bringing up this sort of detail is that I think it illustrates that one of the important ways that our system is able to function and produce legitimate outcomes and not descend into chaos is that we have various officials, Republican as well as Democratic officials, who are not willing to play infinite amounts of hardball for their political party. That there are some limits. Now, in this case, maybe it's the guy's political interest, but one could also say he thought this amount of hardball was one thing too much. And I think that's a helpful thing for the democracy to function.
Yeah, just two small details on that, too. One is this was a Republican who was a Democrat earlier this year and switched parties. And he was the one vote that would have prevented this from happening, because there is a kind of filibuster requirement in Nebraska, which has a unicameral legislature, just one chamber. So it was one vote shy of the 2/3. So it was definitely a majority, but also a place where the filibuster prevented something in a different way than we
Yay,
would
filibuster. Before we turn to the final question out here, Amanda, I meant to ask you this earlier when talking about back to the fairness question. We know there have been some proposals for single states to switch to a proportional basis. So if you get 60% of the votes, you get 60% of the electoral college votes. That's political suicide for a single state to do. Obviously, it makes you much less important because there's just a little. But what about moving to that nationally? Would that ameliorate some of the fairness concerns you have about the electoral college?
Yeah, and I haven't looked into this too much. And one of the weird things when I was looking at the League of Women Voters position is they reject that. And they don't offer reasons for why. They just say that is not an option. We reject the proportional electoral college vote. I would imagine, much like expanding the House, it would do something towards ameliorating kind of the unfairness that we're seeing now. But I just haven't read that much into it. Do you have thoughts, Rick?
No, I haven't given it much thought at all,
Yes.
but I do hear people say, it sounds intuitively fairer, but I don't know, what the calculations would then be and how that might be different than the national popular vote idea. I don't know if either of you want to weigh in.
I think one challenge, and we're in California, so you can say it, right? In the proportional allocation is that you would pick off more Green Party and maybe Libertarian Party candidates in California because they would get just enough of the vote in a state with 53-ish electoral votes to take some of those electoral votes. In 2016, Evan McMullin would have probably pulled a vote or two in Utah. And so when you're looking at 270 electoral votes and you're awarding them proportionately, it's going to look pretty close to 50-50. And then if you take away even just a few votes to Libertarian Green Party candidates, it might be hard for anyone to get 270. So you might increase the risk of those House elections. So there is a fairness, but then there are different risks and different concerns that come up.
Yeah, we'd be like fighting over rounding rules. Because, someone gets 47.3% of the votes and you have a certain number of electoral college votes, you're going to have to decide. All right, we'll take the last question from the audience, please.
Okay. So this question sort of changes the focus to campaigning. Okay, and you talked a little bit about this. So when we had less campaigning that went on in terms of advertisements and national media and so on, and it was done more with in-person rallies, one could argue for an electoral college and making fewer states matter because there's only 24 hours in a day, right? We'd have candidates just collapsing in exhaustion. But now that we have more campaigning, let me ask the question this way. If we got rid of the Electoral College, how would that change campaigning? Not just that, this state would be important, but would it drive campaigning away from these retail in-person rally type events to more of a 60 minutes type interview type of campaigning?
That sounds like a political science question to start. And let me add to that, would it make campaigns more expensive than they already are?
Yeah, no, as you were talking, I just kept the dollar signs kept racking up in my brain because, so my in-laws were visiting this weekend. They're from Wisconsin. And the Rams were playing the Packers, so we all went to SoFi and we watched the Packers. Packers won. Go Pack Go. I married into it. But one thing that my sister-in-law and her partner were saying is how absolutely exhausting it is to live in a swing state. So those of us in California sort of look enviously at these states. Look at how much attention they're getting. Like, look at how much, how many times Tim Walz says, like, Ohio, right, during a debate or during a stump speech, or Pennsylvania. But the reality is, yeah, I think it would cause campaigns to be extremely expensive. And I think you'd have television ads in California exactly like you have television ads running. And we see some of them, right, if you watch any national sports. We interrupt this program for Donald Trump's ad about Kamala giving everybody transgender surgery at the border and or in prison. So you get a little flavor of it when you're watching kind of national programming or national sports here, but we're not getting inundated there. So, yeah.
Joey?
Yeah, I'd just like to add, I think the candidates already spend a lot of time on national 60 Minutes and whatever, but their rallies are there because they work to engage people, and I think you would see with a national popular vote, your first rallies in Midwestern cities not named Omaha if you went to a national popular vote. But I also think it's important to remember that campaigning is not just something that the singular candidate does. I have students who, in order to be involved in some way in a presidential election that they really care about, they're like driving to Arizona, which they can't do very often. This is crazy. All Americans could be engaged in the campaign if we all lived in states where it actually mattered whether we got our friends and neighbors out to vote. And I think the psychology switch of how we all, those of us who aren't in the already swing states, how we all think about the campaign would be quite different in a national popular vote environment. And I hope that Republicans someday in the future will be able to see that there are a lot of Republicans out there who they could potentially engage. But right now it's mostly the Democrats who seem to see this.
Well, it's certainly true that there are more Trump supporters in California than there are in most states, including most states that will vote for Donald Trump.
That's why he's
in the
going to
Electoral College.
Coachella, right?
He is going to Coachella. I think he did Staten Island and Coachella, so those are not exactly swing areas.
Just trying to disprove my argument. I don't understand what the strategy is.
Well, I was giving a talk in New Jersey, and I flew into Philadelphia, and right outside the airport, there was a billboard, Trump, equal justice for all, endorsed by Kanye West. And I was trying to figure out who exactly the audience was for that.
Black people in Philadelphia, right? I mean, it's not a good strategy on his campaign's part because it's not going to win over the black voters of Philly. But
Well, on that note, there's been I've learned a lot from this discussion. Please join me in thanking our panelists today. And let me remind you that we have the third and final in our series next week, talking about the period from Election Day to January 6th. And we've got a really great panel next week as well. So hopefully we'll see you again next week. Thank you all.